During the 2026 World Cup, 8 players from one national team returned doping test results that looked alarming on paper. All 8 results flagged the same banned substance. None of the 8 players were suspended, fined, or even formally charged. That is not a loophole or a cover-up. It is exactly how the testing system was designed to work once you understand one word. The team was Tunisia. The substance was clenbuterol, a drug more commonly associated with cattle farming than with elite athletes. To understand why nobody was punished, you first have to understand how a World Cup drug testing program actually operates. FIFA runs both out-of-competition testing in the months before a tournament and in competition testing during the event itself. For 2026, FIFA partnered directly with the national anti-doping organizations of the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Those organizations led testing across every host city, sending urine samples to World Anti-Doping Agency accredited laboratories for analysis. Under normal rules, a banned substance showing up in a sample produces something called an adverse analytical finding. An adverse analytical finding usually triggers a formal case, a hearing, and in many sports an automatic provisional suspension. That is not what happened to the 8 Tunisian players. Their results were logged under a different, much rarer category.
That category is called an atypical finding, and the difference between the two terms changes everything that follows.
Clenbuterol sits in an unusual place on the World Anti-Doping Agency's prohibited list, built specifically around this exact scenario. Since 2019, any sample returning clenbuterol at or below 5 nanograms per milliliter is automatically logged as atypical, not adverse.
That threshold does not mean clenbuterol is allowed in small amounts. It remains banned at every level with zero tolerance. What the threshold triggers instead is a mandatory investigation, asking one specific question before any punishment is even considered.
Could this low-level trace have come from something the athlete ate, rather than something the athlete deliberately took? For most banned substances, sport still runs on a doctrine called strict liability. Intent barely matters. The substance being present is enough. Clenbuterol became the exception to that doctrine, and the reason traces back to a different World Cup 15 years earlier. In 2011, Mexico hosted the FIFA Under-17 World Cup, and the tournament produced one of the strangest doping stories on record. Testers collected 208 urine samples from players across the tournament. 109 of them came back positive for clenbuterol. Positive traces turned up in players from 19 of the 24 competing nations, spread across almost every team in the event. A result that widespread was not consistent with isolated doping by individual athletes acting alone. So investigators looked past the athletes entirely and started testing the food being served inside the team hotels instead. They collected 47 separate meat samples from those hotel kitchens across the host cities. 14 of the 47 meat samples, roughly 30%, tested positive for clenbuterol residue as well. The concentrations found in that meat ranged from about 0.06 to 11 micrograms per kilogram. FIFA's own medical officer at the time, Dr. Jiri Dvorak, summarized the finding in a single memorable sentence. He called it not a problem of doping but a problem of public health, and the distinction mattered enormously. No formal doping cases were pursued against any of those 109 young athletes in 2011. The host nation's own team, notably, tested completely clean across the board and went on to win that tournament outright. Their staff had quietly shifted the squad onto a diet built around fish and vegetables well before the event began. That single practical choice appears to have been enough to keep every one of their own samples clear of contamination. To understand why the contamination happened at all, you need to know why clenbuterol exists in livestock farming in the first place. Clenbuterol is a legitimate veterinary drug, approved in some countries to treat breathing conditions in animals like horses. It also happens to shift an animal's body composition, reducing fat and increasing lean muscle mass when fed over time. That side effect makes it valuable to some cattle farmers, because leaner meat can sell at a noticeably higher price. Using it as a growth promoter in food animals has been illegal in Mexico for years, precisely because of this exact risk. Illegal does not mean absent. Enforcement across a large, decentralized livestock supply chain is a genuinely difficult regulatory problem. The same substance that helps an illegal feed additive turn a profit also happens to be prohibited in human sport for a different reason entirely. In athletes, clenbuterol can help burn fat and preserve muscle mass, which is exactly why some competitors have deliberately misused it. One drug, 2 completely separate industries, and one identical chemical signature showing up in a laboratory analysis either way. That overlap is precisely what forced the World Anti-Doping Agency to eventually build an entirely separate rule just for this substance. By 2021, the agency had gone further, setting formal minimum reporting limits for several livestock-related substances at once. Clenbuterol, ractopamine, zilpaterol, and zeranol were all included, 4 different substances all tied to the same contamination risk. Every one of those 4 compounds shares the same basic profile: a legitimate livestock use and a banned status in human athletes. That regulatory history sat quietly in the background for 15 years, largely unnoticed outside anti-doping and food science circles. Then came the 2026 World Cup, hosted jointly across the United States, Mexico, and Canada. Tunisia's squad was based in Mexico for a stretch of the tournament, training and staying in the same host cities as every other team. Around early July, reports surfaced that 8 members of the squad had returned clenbuterol findings in their routine testing. Because every one of those 8 results sat at or below the 5 nanogram threshold, they were logged as atypical, not adverse. That single classification automatically triggered the same kind of investigation FIFA and Mexican authorities had already run once before, in 2011. Investigators again looked toward the food supply first, rather than assuming 8 separate athletes had each chosen to cheat. Reporting on the case pointed to contaminated meat consumed at the team's Mexico base as the most likely source of the traces. Anti-doping officials publicly stated they considered the findings most likely food contamination, not deliberate use of the substance. FIFA informed the players' individual clubs of the situation directly, as part of standard results management procedure. No provisional suspensions were issued, no hearings were scheduled, no public disciplinary case was ever opened against any of the 8. This is not because clenbuterol suddenly became a lesser offense somewhere between 2011 and 2026. It is because the system had already been redesigned years earlier, specifically to handle a scenario exactly like this one.
Compare that outcome to how strict liability normally functions for almost every other substance on the prohibited list.
In most doping cases, an athlete's explanation for how a substance entered their body carries very little weight at the hearing stage.
The presence of the substance alone is generally treated as sufficient grounds for a sanction, regardless of the athlete's stated intent.
Clenbuterol only escapes that default because regulators built a documented, repeatable pattern of contamination risk into the rule itself.
208 samples in 2011 and independently confirmed meat contamination created a paper trail too large to dismiss as coincidence. Without that specific documented history, the World Anti-Doping Agency would likely have had no basis to carve out an exception at all. That is the deeper structural point sitting underneath this story. The exception was earned by evidence, not granted out of leniency. It also means the exception is narrow by design, applying only to this specific substance at this specific low concentration range. A higher concentration reading would have pushed the same 8 results back into adverse territory, with real disciplinary consequences attached. The margin separating a quiet internal investigation from a public suspension case can come down to a few nanograms.
That is an unusually thin line for a sports integrity system to rest on, even with 15 years of supporting data behind it. Teams have learned to treat that thin line as a genuine operational risk, not just a theoretical one.
Following the 2011 precedent, some squads have quietly built contamination avoidance directly into their tournament nutrition planning. Shifting toward fish and vegetables in high-risk regions, exactly as Mexico's own 2011 squad reportedly did, is one common approach.
Sourcing meat exclusively from vetted, traceable suppliers with documented testing records is another increasingly common safeguard.
None of these precautions are mandated by FIFA. They exist because individual medical staffs have decided the risk is worth managing directly. That leaves an uneven playing field of its own. Some federations can afford dedicated nutrition and food safety staff, many cannot. A wealthier federation's medical department might catch a contamination risk before a single test is ever administered.
A smaller federation may simply eat whatever the host hotel kitchen serves and hope the concentration stays under 5 nanograms.
The underlying regulatory gap runs even deeper than any single team's nutrition budget, though. Enforcing a ban on illegal livestock feed additives is the job of national food safety and agricultural authorities, not sports regulators. FIFA has no direct authority over how cattle are raised or fed anywhere in the world, including inside its own host countries. It can only test the athletes standing on the field and react to whatever shows up afterward in the laboratory results. A sports governing body ended up building an entire evidentiary framework purely to compensate for gaps in food safety enforcement elsewhere. That is the compound structure sitting underneath a story that first looked like a simple doping scandal. An agricultural enforcement gap in one country's supply chain quietly became a permanent line item inside a global sports rulebook. The rule did not appear because World Anti-Doping Agency scientists set out to study cattle farming. It appeared because one tournament in one country in 2011 produced numbers too consistent to explain any other way. 15 years and one more World Cup later, that same rule quietly protected 8 more players from a case they never should have faced. Whether the underlying food safety gap itself ever actually closes is a completely separate question and not one FIFA can answer alone. Future tournaments will keep testing for clenbuterol at the same 5 nanogram threshold, regardless of which country hosts next. If the same contamination pattern shows up again at a future World Cup, the response will likely look almost identical. Quiet investigation, contamination most likely confirmed, no suspension, and very little public attention paid to the actual mechanism behind it. The headline every time reads like a doping scandal. The underlying story, both times now, has actually been about supply chains and thresholds. 8 players walked away from a positive-seeming result with no case against them, and the reason had nothing to do with luck. It came down to a decision limit written years earlier, built from evidence nobody at the time expected to need again. Compound World covers the events, decisions, and power structures that shape the world economics, finance, sports, and beyond, grounded in real data. No hot takes, no manufactured outrage.